Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. So a few months ago I did a video about the OpenDingux Beta firmware. And there have been quite a few updates to this firmware since I did that last video, so I thought it was time to revisit it here in 2021. And probably the most significant update we've seen between then and now is the fact that RetroArch now runs on this firmware. Which means that RetroArch can now take advantage of a lot of those performance improvements that are available in the beta firmware. And so in today's video, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the updates to the OpenDingux Beta, but I'm also going to show a lot about how to run RetroArch on this new firmware. Now in this guide, I'm primarily going to use an RG350M, but this beta firmware works for a number of different devices. Basically everything within the RG350 line, and then both of the RG280 devices as well. And in addition to the RetroArch update, I'm also going to show off some standalone emulators like the PlayStation 1 emulator, which has also seen significant performance improvements thanks to the beta firmware. So without any further delay, let's jump into it. So it's been a while since I did my initial beta firmware video, so let's do a quick recap of everything that's good about this firmware. Number one, it has improved performance over the stock firmware. They updated to a modern kernel and then updated the drivers and other things like that. In addition, you can just plug in the device into your computer and then access everything via USB. It's a very easy way to transfer files back and forth on your SD cards. This firmware also provides a true sleep mode. You just hit the power and Y button. And they've also upgraded the interface on the RG350M to take advantage of that 640 by 480 display. Upgrading this firmware is very easy. It's just one single OPK that works for all the devices. And compatibility for this is getting better and better. We're going to talk about RetroArch, but Simple Menu also works for it now, as well as a bunch of other emulators. So a few months ago, I also did a dedicated video about RetroArch on the RG350 systems. And this version of RetroArch is kind of a beast. It had to be built specifically for the RG350 devices and for OpenDingux. Now all of the systems you see on the screen here are all of the cores that were built into the original RetroArch for RG350 devices. And honestly, it's quite a bit of variety. Basically everything except for PS1 can play pretty well on RetroArch. And the thing I really like about using RetroArch on the RG350 is that it unifies a lot of the system interfaces for the device itself. So for example, you have universal cheats, an easy way to access and save off your save games, and also an easy way to configure button mapping and scaling. One of the things I never really enjoyed about the original RG350 devices is that the emulators are just kind of all over the place. You have to use different buttons to close out certain games and things like that. This kind of unifies that entire experience. Now RetroArch has also been upgraded since then, and now it supports other systems. So the systems you see all on the screen now have dedicated cores for the RetroArch on the RG350 and 280 devices. Now these two lists don't cover every single thing that you can emulate on the RG350, but it's getting pretty close. So even though I'm now using RetroArch about 95% of the time when I use the RG350M, I can still jump into those standalone emulators if there's a certain system or a certain game I really want to play. So rather than making whole new dedicated guides for these updates, I've just updated the original guides that I'd made. Now in today's video, we're going to go from scratch. I'm going to show you quickly how to download and install the stock firmware and then how to run OpenDingux Beta on top of it. So within my beta guide, just go to the installation instructions and then pick out the device that you're using. And then just select the download here option. This is going to download the stock SD image for that device. Next, you just want to go down one paragraph and click on the next link, which will take you to the OpenDingux Beta firmware apps. You're going to want to grab the one that says GCW0. And this is just going to be an OPK file. Just go ahead and download that as well. And then finally, we're going to go to retroarch.com, go to the Downloads tab, and then scroll all the way down until you find the OpenDingux section. And you'll see there is a stock version as well as a beta firmware version. We're going to download the beta firmware version. Okay, so once you have all three of these files downloaded, let's go ahead and extract them. We'll start with RetroArch. Just go ahead and select Extract Files, and then hit OK. Now within the RetroArch folder, you're going to have two different files, an OPK as well as a .retroarch folder. We're going to need both of those. Next, you want to extract the SD card image as well. So now we're just going to want to burn that image to an SD card. There's several different apps you can use like Balena Etcher and Win32 Disk Imager. I'm going to use this one called Rufus. It's very lightweight and easy to use, but any of these will work just fine. So within Rufus, I'm just going to grab my internal SD card. I'm using a 16 gigabyte SD card here. And then I'm going to press the select button and then find that SD card image and then hit the start button. And it's going to ask you, do you really want to do this? And you say, yeah, man, I want to do it, and hit OK. It'll take a minute to write the image and we're almost done at this point. Next, you're going to want to use an app called Disk Genius. This is going to allow us to resize the partition so that we can take advantage of the entire SD card. So you can see here, here's the SD card here, 16 gigabytes. You're going to want to select the primary partition. It's an ext4 partition. Go ahead and right click on that and then select Resize Partition. And then you just want to drag the partition to take up all of the unallocated space. And then you just hit start and you say, yeah, man, I want to do it. And there you go. Okay, once this is done, you can go ahead and eject your internal SD card. We're not going to need that one anymore. But we are going to use our external card to put on some of these software files. So go ahead and put in your 350 or 280 external SD card. And then if you don't already, make sure you have a folder called Apps in your root folder. Next, move over the OpenDingux Beta firmware OPK. And then go into that RetroArch folder and grab that RetroArch OPK as well. And that's it. Go ahead and eject your SD card and let's go onto the device itself. Okay, so I'm going to take that 16 gigabyte SD card that has the firmware on it and I'm going to put it in the TF1 or the internal SD card slot. And then I'm going to insert the external SD card into the second slot. And then go ahead and power it up. It'll take a minute the first time you turn it on. Okay, so this is going to boot directly into the stock firmware. Just go ahead and select the OS Update OPK, and then Update, and then hit the Start button. And this is going to flash the beta firmware on top of the stock firmware. Once it's done, it's going to ask you to hit Start to confirm. Okay, so here we are with the beta firmware. As you can see, all the icons have been updated from my last video, and it has some games on it, but those are all the stock games. But you can see RetroArch is there. So we need to start up RetroArch one time in order to insert all of the system files. Okay, once that's done, go ahead and quit RetroArch. And now, since we're using the beta firmware, we can actually just use USB to connect directly to our computer. And it should pick up on it immediately, but if it doesn't, go over to the settings, then USB mode, and then go to mass storage and press start. At that point, either your Mac or PC will recognize your device. Okay, so here we are back on my computer, and you can see on the left here I have all the folders for my RG350 device. So let's install those RetroArch system files. We're going to go into the home folder and then the .RetroArch folder. If you don't see this, you need to enable hidden files in your Windows Explorer. So once you're inside the .RetroArch folder, go ahead and open up the other one that we downloaded and then move all of these files and folders over. And it'll ask you if you want to overwrite, just go ahead and hit yes. Okay, so now we have RetroArch fully loaded. Another thing I recommend you do is go into the RetroArch system folder and move over all of your BIOS files. I have all of these listed in the written guide, which I have linked in the video description. Additionally, I also made a video about how to run Mario 64 on the RG350, so I'm going to move that OPK over into my apps folder here. So you'll have to watch the Mario 64 video in order to install this, but it's very easy to do and it's kind of fun. And finally, the last thing we want to do is to add our own standalone emulators. So if you go back to my OpenDingux Beta guide, you'll see a list here of all the different emulators that work on the beta firmware. So if there's any specific systems you want to try out, this is where you're going to download them from. Now, two in particular that I'm going to download here are going to be for PS1 and Game Boy Advance. And these were actually made by the same developer who was the lead developer for RetroArch on the RG350. So I'd recommend downloading the most recent version of these, make sure you get the beta versions, and then grab them for both the PS1 emulator as well as the Game Boy Advance. In addition to my own list, I would recommend you go over to this repository made by a developer named Game Blah Blah, and he has a lot of great updated beta apps as well. Okay, so now we've moved over all the files we need to so we can unplug our device and actually get into it. Let's start with RetroArch. Now I have a complete RetroArch guide for RG350 devices on my website, so I'll show off a few basics in this video, but if you want the really in-depth coverage, go to that one instead. First thing, we need to add playlists. So let's go into the playlist section and then go to import content. And in the content directory section, you're going to want to find whatever system it is you want to add the playlist for. Let's do it for Super Nintendo. So I'm going to navigate to my external SD card and then my Super Nintendo folder, and I'm going to select scan this directory. For system name, I'm just going to navigate down to Nintendo, Super Nintendo. Now the SNES has two different cores you can choose from. I'm going to start with the SNES 9X 2005 Plus version. This one has much better sound, but it can affect performance for some of the harder to emulate games. But I'll show you a workaround for that later on. Okay, once you have those added, go ahead and hit Start Scan. And this will scan through that folder and find all the SNES games. Now when we go into the playlist section, you can see we have a Super Nintendo section, and here are all the games. So like always, we're going to start with Super Mario World. Now you can see immediately that the screen is a little bit off center, so let me show you how to fix that. To get into the RetroArch menu, all you have to do is tap the power button. Within here, back out to the settings section. Once you're in settings, go to video, and then scaling. Make sure the integer scaling is off, and keep aspect ratio is off as well. This will allow the emulator to figure out what the aspect ratio should be. Now when you jump back into the game, you can see it takes up the full screen. But the quality is not so great. You can see it's just kind of fuzzy around the edges. So I'll show you how to fix that one as well real quick. We're going to go back into RetroArch, back into the settings, and then under video, we're going to change the image interpolation from bicubic to nearest neighbor. For Super Nintendo in particular, this gives you very sharp pixels. So here we are. I think it looks pretty good. If you want perfect pixels, you're going to have to use integer scaling in the video settings, but it's going to make the screen a little bit smaller. But that's the nice thing about RetroArch is it gives you the option to make all of those changes if you like. Okay, so going back to that dedicated RetroArch guide that I was talking about earlier, there are all sorts of tips and tricks in this guide, but the one I want to talk about is the recommended per system settings. So in this section, you'll see all the systems that are available, as well as some of my recommended settings, for example, whether or not to have integer scaling, or whether or not to apply a video filter. So I'd recommend going through this guide, and then changing all of your settings on RetroArch to match these. These are the ones that the developers recommended to me initially, and I think they all look great with these settings. Okay, so now let's talk about RetroArch performance on the beta firmware. I think the best way to show this is by using Super Mario World 2. So here I am using the SNES 9X 2005 Plus core. This is the standard core on here. And you can see I'm getting about 46 or 47 frames per second. And this game is notoriously difficult to emulate. But if we go in and change the core to the regular 2005 core here, you'll see that performance is up to 60 frames per second. It looks just beautiful this way. It's actually really fun to play. Just look at how smooth everything runs on this. Okay, let me give you another example with Final Fantasy III. There's a certain scene right here in the beginning that always dips in frame rate. You can see here it starts at 51 frames per second and then it dips down to 46 frames per second. And that's very typical for this part of this game. Now let's switch over to that regular 2005 core. And look at that, a solid 59 through the entire scene. To me, that's an indication that Final Fantasy III is going to play great on RetroArch here. Now it's not all perfect. For example, Super Mario RPG, even if I use just the regular 2005 core, has some slowdown. As you can see here, the gameplay will dip down to 57 frames per second. Not the end of the world, but if you want perfect gameplay for Mario RPG, this isn't going to give it to you, unfortunately. And same thing here with Star Fox. You can see here I'm getting about 41 frames per second here. But to be fair, if I use the standalone Pocket SNES emulator, I'm getting about 53 or 54 frames per second this way anyway. So Star Fox just doesn't play well on this device, unfortunately. But I'm kind of being nitpicky at this point because 99% of Super Nintendo games are going to play just great on RetroArch. Some of the best games on this system, for example Shaq Fu, plays at a solid 60 frames per second. If you want to play the single best fighting game available on the Super Nintendo, here you go. And I'm kidding, by the way, this game sucks. Okay, let's move over to NES. Performance on this is just solid. It's so good. And honestly, the standalone NES emulator is pretty good, but I love having the ability to have universal cheats as well as all the different scaling options I can have with this NES core. This is one of those moments where I really appreciate having the ability to have universal button mapping as well as universal cheats. Now, Game Boy games really shine on this device as well because you have the whole spectrum of colorization available to you. Personally, I like to use this green colorization, but you have hundreds of different color palettes available to you. And you've got a lot of freedom to navigate when it comes to scaling as well. So for example, here I'm playing with integer scaling. This will give me perfectly square pixels, but at the expense of having a slightly reduced screen size. And Game Boy Color use the same RetroArch core, so you can see here I'm using integer scaling for this one as well, so a slightly reduced screen size. But I can easily bump that up to a larger screen size, and then if I use a specific filter to kind of smooth out the pixels, everything looks nice and square again. Again, all this is in the written guide, but I just want to show off how nice everything can look. Now another thing thanks to the OpenDingux Beta firmware is that Game Boy Advance runs at full speed now. And then you can go in and change it to the aspect ratio of the Game Boy Advance, and everything looks really good. And for the most part, every game that I played ran perfectly on the Game Boy Advance core. Now that being said, if you do happen to find a game that doesn't run very well, then you can use the standalone Game Boy emulator here. And this emulator has quite a lot of image scaling options. Not quite as much as RetroArch, but you still have a lot of freedom to navigate here. Personally, I like to use the hardware grid or the hardware scale 2x settings. Here we are with the hardware grid scaling, and it looks really nice. And this game plays well on the RetroArch core as well, but it's always good to have this standalone option too. Okay, let's move on to other RetroArch supported systems. Here I'm playing Game Gear and everything is working just great. Same thing with Sega Genesis. I didn't find a single game that had any issues running RetroArch. And Sega CD also played really well. Now arcade systems are limited to CPS1 and CPS2 as well as Neo Geo, but the games you can play run really well. So for example, here's Marvel vs. Capcom using the CPS2 core, and I'm getting a solid 59-60 frames per second the entire time. Now before we get into Neo Geo, let's go ahead and take a quick cat break. Here's my cat Chicken, she's just really enjoying this OpenDingux Beta firmware. Now Chicken and I both love Neo Geo, and we really love the Last Blade game. This is our favorite game to play. And I have to say that running this at 60 frames per second on this screen is probably the best way I've ever played this game before. I don't think this video is really conveying how crisp and beautiful this game plays. And honestly, this was the turning point for me. The moment I played this game, I was like, okay, this is the real deal here. We're back into prime time. This OpenDingux Beta firmware, coupled with RetroArch, is just a joy to play. Okay, so let me show off some of the new cores that are available since my last video update. We'll start with ScumVM. What you want to do is go into Load Core, select ScumVM, and then Start Core. And this will bring up the ScumVM menu here. Here you want to select Add Game, and then navigate to wherever your games are stored. For me, I'm going to go into Media, then my RG350 SD card, into ROMs, and then ScumVM. And within here, I have all sorts of subfolders of all my ScumVM games. And then select one of the games. And all you have to do is just open the folder that contains the game files. Once you have that opened, go ahead and select Choose. And it should automatically detect which game is within there. And then to start the game, all you have to do is press Start. And so here we are. Here's Beavis and Butthead Virtual Stupidity. What a ridiculous game. Now that being said, the standalone ScumVM emulator works just fine on the OpenDingux Beta firmware. So if the games aren't running perfectly on RetroArch, you still have that as an option. Now one exciting feature is that RetroArch has embedded the DOSBox Pure core, which basically allows you to run zipped DOS games. So you can see here I'm going to go into my DOS playlist, and then I'm going to select the Jill of the Jungle zip file. And within that, it's going to ask me which executable file to use. I'm going to use the Jill one. And look at that, it just starts right up. Now admittedly, performance on DOSBox is not quite perfect yet, but it's still really promising to be able to just take your zipped DOS files and be able to play them instantly like this. If you've ever tried to run DOS games before, you know it's kind of a bit of a pain. And this takes care of all that work for you. In general, most of the games had some pretty big slowdown. But this is a very new core for RetroArch, so I'm hoping to see a lot of good improvements in the future on this one. Okay, so moving away from RetroArch, let's try out the PS1 standalone emulator. Now this runs just like any other emulator that you would find on the RG350 devices. You just go into the menu and select your game. But performance on this is just silky smooth. According to the developer, he's seen improvements of 5 to 10 frames per second on these PS1 games using the beta firmware. That's a huge performance boost. And of course, just a quick verification here that the Super Mario 64 standalone port runs just fine on this as well. Unfortunately, it only runs at a 320 by 240 resolution, so it doesn't take advantage of the 640 by 480 resolution on the RG350M, but it still runs super smooth, and it's kind of amazing to be able to play a Nintendo 64 game on such a low-powered device like this. Alright everyone, that's it for this video. I really just wanted to give you an update on the beta firmware and the fact that it runs RetroArch now. I think this is a really exciting thing for the RG350, and it shows just how much dedication is within this community. Here we are with a device that's basically been overshadowed by other modern devices over the past year, yet people are still plugging away and making this thing better and better every day. So if you have an RG350 device, I would encourage you to brush some of that dust off it and maybe try out this beta firmware with RetroArch. To me, it's really breathed life into this device. So let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming!